Hey everyone, welcome to the McNuttiest dimension. I'm Chris McNutt. I'm glad you could take some time, hang out, check out some shit from the consciousness salon. A seat, your very own seat in the consciousness salon. We have nothing to do except expand our perspective and check things out from a new angle, because the more perspective, it's only perspective, people. There is no truth. It's just perspective. Yes, we get locked into our own truth. We like things to be predictable. We like things to be quote unquote normal. We don't want to wake up every morning in a whole new reality that we want to figure out. That would be a pain in the ass. Some days would be like, oh, freaking cool, man. My plants are growing out of the ceiling. But most days would just be like, I'm just trying to get my shit done, and my plants are growing out of the ceiling today, and my car is actually, a leopard or something like that. Who knows? Like, if reality was that liquid, for us, anyways, the humans, it's traumatic enough down here. Apparently there's realms out there, there's realities out there that are that liquid. We can go have that experience when we go and be a life form in that dimension, in that realm. But ours, we like predictability. We like some stability. So that's cool. But perspective, people, that's what we need. We need to expand the network. Sometimes you got to just go for a walk in the forest. Go for a walk in the forest. Get out of the city. Go look for some mushrooms. It's fall time, people. The mushrooms of all descriptions are popping up. I don't know where you live, but the woods around my place, man, it is like just downtown Mushroom City. And turns out, I found out, like, full disclosure here, I'm not super rooted to this earth plane. Duh. You might have figured that out by now. I'm a, upper chakra kind of guy. I sometimes think I barely got my toenails. I'm hanging on by my toenails down here in the practical three-dimensional world. I want to get up into the world of ideas and consciousness. Whoa, man, thinking about shit and talking about stuff. I'm there. I'm really good at a dinner party, but don't maybe call me up if you need me to help you fix your car or do something practical. Sometimes I'm just hanging on by my toenails here, and that includes my connection with the natural world. I try to ground. It's almost like this conscious thing I do. I know I'm so much in that other direction that I go for long walks and focus on my feet chakras and opening them up and just connecting to the earth. And I spend some time out in the forest, and I smell smells, and I feel trees, and I sit on the sides of hills, and I do my best to connect. Now, if you're wired the other way and you do that, like you're a farmer, you maybe take some time and connect the other way. Get up into your higher chakras. That might be the thing that you need to do for balance. I know I need to go earthy the other direction. So I'm not super hip to the natural world of like mushrooms. I've always been this like, whoa, the hell are those things? Are just kind of weird. But recently, damn, has my respect for the whole Mycelium Kingdom. Now I know what it's called. It's the Mycelium Kingdom, because the mushrooms, everybody, newsflash, I'm just figuring this stuff out myself, are just the fruiting body. They're like the apples on the tree or the berries, right? So when you see a mushroom sitting there, it's just like the apple. But where's the rest of the damn apple tree, you say? It's underground. It's just this network of little like hair-like spaghetti that just goes through logs and moss and trees and rotted things, and it just lives off all that decomposing stuff. And it connects the forest. It's like the neural pathway, and kind of like it helps the consciousness of the forest flow. It helps trees communicate with each other. It's a symbiotic relationship. This hidden life of trees check out that book. I don't know who it's written by. I can't remember the name. It was a German forester, just spent years in the forest. And it came up with this, wow, wonderful book, Hidden Life of Trees. And there's lots of other new studies as where things are going, understandings that we have, this world of like mushrooms. How mycelium it's, as I said, it's kind of like the consciousness of the forest. So no doubt, it kind of has some medicinal effects on our own consciousness. Now, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, all of that world is super hip. People are microdosing. People are shrooming out. People are doing, it's plant medicine. When I was a kid, it was just you did some shrooms and you tripped around in the park. Now it's like, no, it's a spiritual practice, which is great to take it to the next level, a hell of a lot more focused than we had when we were just doing shrooms and ripping around the park for the afternoon. And no doubt leads to greater experiences in understanding. Hallelujah. You guys fill your boots with that sort of stuff. But there's other mushrooms as well that are coming on. Lion's mane. Damn. Check out lion's mane and reishi. And these are medicinal mushrooms that help with our nervous system, nervine tonics, help with brain health, the mind, all this sort of. So there's this interaction with mushrooms and consciousness and stuff like that going on. So my guest today on the McNuttiest Dimension is Robert Rogers. He's a retired botanist and herbalist who has practiced for close to 50 years in Canada. He's traveled all over the world. He has written 57 books on the subject of herbal medicine, herbs, mushrooms. And his 58th book is coming out soon that is about the history of psilocybin mushrooms. Maybe you're listening to this now and it's already out on the streets. Please join me in giving a big McNuttiest dimension. Welcome the master herbalist, Robert Rogers. Welcome, Robert. Thanks for taking the time to be here today.
You're welcome.
And how do you self-describe yourself? If I met you at a dinner party, you would say, I am
a retired herbal elder of Canada.
You say you're retired, but when you were active professionally, what was your professional description of yourself?
Yeah, so my profession, I started off early on, around 50 years ago, got a degree in botany from the U of A, and then I went up north and I happened to live between two reserves at the time, and each of them one had a male and one a female Cree medicine person. So I started looking at plants around the area there, which I knew nothing about. And that began my journey of finding out, kind of pursuing my interest in the medicinal aspects of plants. So that's how it started out. And then I went around the world. I spent time in, Alert Bay, British Columbia with Norma Myers way back in the day, then California, then England, then Spain, and then a couple of years in the early 80s in 2 years in Peru. And then in 1984, I set up a clinical practice in Edmonton and did that for nearly 20 years. Retired from that to give myself time to do more research and writing. I've written now 57 books. In fact, my latest one on psilocybin just is going to be released next week.
So as somebody you talked about sort of being your first education in the plant world was medicinal. So how do you describe that? Like there's lots of different ways to interact with plants and their energy, and you sort of describe the medicinal properties. So what does that mean to you?
Well, maybe I'll tell you a little story from back in that day, and it might help explain it. There was an indigenous healer, Rose Auger, at the Driftpile Reserve near where I was living. And so one day I knocked on her door and I said, Rose, would you teach me about, the indigenous use of plant medicine? And she looks right at me and she says, well, maybe. And so I said, can we start? She said, well, come back tomorrow. So I went back the next day and she said, I want you to go in the woods. I want you to sit with a plant. And then on the next day, I want you to come and tell me what you found out. And I said to myself, oh, well, easy peasy. I'm a botanist, for goodness sake. And so I went in the woods, and the first plant I saw was a wild sarsaparilla, Aurelia nudicollis, which I believe is up in your part of the world as well. And I sat with it for a while, didn't pay that much attention really, and went back the next day and told her what I thought. And she looks right at me and she goes, no. So I left. And so I went back the next day and I went to the plant and I sat with it and I paid a little more attention. I noted how the rhizome grew, what it smelled like, what it tasted like, how the stalk went up and divided into three. And then there were 3 to 5 leaves on each of those divides, and told her all that scientific head stuff, that technocratic kind of approach. And I went back the next day and told her, and she says, no. So then I went home and I was kind of pissed. And I was kind of, like, well, I don't need her. I don't need to do this, whatever. And but I did. I went out a third day. And so I'm sitting there with the plant. It's about, 6 feet away from me. And, it was kind of like a nice warm early fall day, and the leaves had just turned yellow on it. And so I smoked a little bit of a joint, had a little nap. And then as I'm just kind of sitting back up, this snowshoe hare is over in the corner of my eye. And it looks at me and I'm looking at it and I'm not moving. And it slowly lops along, comes right up to the plant, nibbles on the leaf, looks right at me, and then lops off into the woods. I thought, So I'd had nothing. So the next morning I went back to Rose and I said, well, Rose, I don't know, but I think it has something to do with rabbits. And she goes, her eyes got big and her smile on her face. And she goes, okay, I'll teach you. And much later, I learned that the Cree name translates into rabbit root. And so that's how it started.
So it was, coming out of botany, and then there's this understanding that these plants are maybe like beings that are interacting with us on multiple layers.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So then outside of the medicinal qualities of a plant, what's your take on, say, general plant energy and sort of their consciousness? What are they here to do? What's their life journey outside of the interaction with us humans?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think there would be, it's well known, there would be no plants on the earth if it was not for the early stages of the algae that, little cyanobacterium floating in the ocean who wanted to somehow get onto land that was, cooling volcanic land. And without that, without the symbiosis of those algae who can produce energy from solar energy, combining with fungi to form lichens that came onto the solid part of the earth and then started to degrade that rock into soil that allowed plants to start to evolve. And that's kind of all where it started, several, billion years ago.
So plants have a mission somehow. They are doing this interaction with the upper layer of the, say, the, I don't know what you call it, the Earth's crust that was once lava, and then they helped kind of turn it into soil?
Well, they certainly they've evolved just like we have evolved as humanoids. I mean, there was a evolutionary over hundreds and of millions of years in evolution, and the fungi are much more related to us than plants. Fungi can't produce their own food, so they needed that communication and that connection. The fungi provided the shelter to prevent the algae from drying out on soil and on the rocks, and the algae provided the lichens the food, and that has been going on forever. In fact, there is a huge mycelial mat of fungi all over the world underground that have a connection with plants, and it's not so much socialistic as it is a little more capitalist in a sense that the plants themselves require nutrients and water, which because the fungi mycelium are connected with the mycelium of root hairs of all of these plants, they can provide those. But what the fungi need are sugar, and so there is this give and take. The plants provide sugar, the fungi provide nutrients and water, and that kind of goes on. And that particular relationship of communication, in fact, it's so intense that, for example, in a group of trees, let us say there's a group of trees and one of the trees is ailing. The mother tree in the area, which is so important, why we should be discouraging the present forestry system that we have. The mother tree, the largest one in the area, sends a message of communication to the mycelium to feed extra nutrients to the ailing tree to help it recover. So it is a communication that we can tune into on an auditory level, not even visually, really. Well, a little bit visually, but it's at a frequency we don't understand, but it's going on.
Now, just to back up a little bit, you mentioned plants, and you also mentioned mycelium. So, from your botanist perspective, these are separate life forms, so to speak. You wouldn't say the mycelium is a plant, and you wouldn't.
The mycelium is the living entity of the fruiting bodies of mushrooms that you see above the earth, right?
But you're considering it, say, a different species from, say, plants, where you would say all the trees and herbs and grasses and that sort of thing.
They're a totally different kingdom. Yeah, they were. In fact, when I started my university degree in '68, there were only two kingdoms on the planet, according to scientists, plants and animals. And then fungi were integrated as its own kingdom in the early '70s, called the Fifth Kingdom. And so, yeah, that's how recent, really, when you think about it, the fungi have been totally ignored, and yet they are the great communicators.
So the relationship you have with plants, scientific, you analyze, say, medicinal properties, scientific properties, but would you say you also have an energetic connection with the plant world and the mycelium world, like to be able to feel it as well as understand the energies?
Well, a little bit. I wouldn't say I'm an empath, but I have spent enough time, and I encourage my students to spend time with plants to get an understanding that there's a personality and a spiritual property to plants, and they're very individual to each species. And in my books, I do write about that. I actually talk not just about the traditional uses by indigenous people of boreal plants, but also modern science, like what chemicals are in there that make it work the way it works, but also tuning into these more subtle vibrations of personality and spirituality that I think are critically important to get a full feeling for the entities and to appreciate what they have to offer.
So on that energetic sense, say, lack of a better term, call it like sort of the consciousness that, the plant world, the mycelium world is operating on. Do you feel, sense, understand a difference there between what mycelium has to offer and what it's doing here in our system of life compared to the plant realm?
Well, fungi, the fruiting bodies in the mycelium, that's a different category. And the plants are also. With plants, I've had a long experience. I think my first, what I would call a flower essence, that is taking petals from a flower, putting them in a crystal bowl for 4 hours of uninterrupted sunlight, and then discerning the vibrational benefit that they can confer to uh, to animals, including ourselves, humans, is very interesting. And I've been doing that. I have a line. My wife and I have a line called Prairie Diva Flower Essences, which look at some of the boreal and prairie plants, and
So
that's been
just to be clear, then when you're making an essence, it's not the same as say you're making a plant medicine. You're not making a salve or a tincture
right,
or
right,
a tea,
right.
where that is more trying to access medicinal properties of the plant. The essences are sort of accessing the energetics.
Yeah, that's correct. The medicinal plants, whether they're taken as an herbal tea, they're made into an alcohol tincture, and then or pills or whatever, and taken for mainly for physical, but a little bit of I would say mental and emotional patterns. But the essences of both flowers and mushrooms are more for the spiritual side of helping correct. In the case of flower essences, bringing light into areas of dark. That is, uh, perhaps old patterns that we had that were useful for us as children that we no longer need. Helping reveal to us why we have this particular pattern. Why do we react a particular way when a particular word or person says something, or even the energetics of a person? Sometimes you'll get a feeling like, you know what? There's something about that person really I don't like. I don't know what it is, but it's always about you, and so helping to discern what that's about and help you re-educate yourself about that and how so that you can move on and feel
So
more comfortable. Yeah.
so these so you're saying you take a plant essence as opposed to the medicinal side where it's like you're trying to heal some physical ailment or something like that. This is you're working again, as you say, with the energetics, and you described almost like talk therapy, or the new world where everyone's exploring trauma and inner children,
Well, it
and
does. Yeah. Yeah.
and so these essences are you're saying they work on those same levels.
Yeah, they work really well. I mean, they work well with psychology, including Jungian psychology, because sometimes what they act as is catalysts to perhaps remind or remember your dreams. Very often, when I would do clinical work, I would say keep a dream journal while you're taking this flower essence, and then in the next discussion, there might be one key word that opens up a whole envelope of memory, like Proust's, smelling a cookie, and all of a sudden he writes 7 volumes of book about memories of his childhood. So they can be very useful, and they really don't do any harm. I mean, basically, they're just petals on water. There's no physical substance there. We're now talking about the energetics of it.
Right. And so, like, compared to, say, cannabis or psilocybin or like alcohol, like these, properties that, we have real physical feelings in our body, could, say they're psychoactive and that sort of thing. Is that the type of experience one would feel when kind of using plant essences?
Well, you would certainly not get the altered physiological kind of
They don't
state.
make you high, so to speak.
No, but psychologically, it gives your spirit the opportunity to look at what your pattern is, how it developed, and perhaps deal with it. For example, let's say you had a pattern that you developed as a young child where you always deferred to your parents and whatever they said you believed and blah, blah, blah. And as you got a little older, you're going, well, really, I don't know. And that pattern that may have developed may lead you down a pathway that isn't really fulfilling you, isn't creating happiness and joy in your life. And so it gives you an opportunity to think, is that me or is that my parents speaking, for example? And so the energetic of the flower essence allows people to re-examine their past history and move forward. Sometimes people get stuck and they get in ruts with, this is the way I've always done it. This is always the way I've done it. And, that doesn't allow you to move forward.
Plant kingdom is solar, mycelium is underground, and the flower petal essence sits in a bowl and makes no sound. I met a rabbit once when no one was around. So compared to the medicinal side of things where, herbalists make tinctures and make teas and all this sort of stuff, what is the process for making an essence?
Yeah, so it's very simple. I've worked with my wife with flower essences, and I've worked on my own with mushroom essences, and I'll explain the former first. So you basically go into the woods, you find a plant with flowers that you want to explore, and then you take and you don't use anything except wood or sticks. I like to use chopsticks. You don't want anything metal. You don't want to cut them. So you first of all prepare a crystal bowl with water, spring water, pure water, distilled if you have to. And then you layer the top with the petals of whatever flower you're working with.
And it's only the petals. You're only going for flowers here. No roots, no stems, no leaves.
No leaves, but the flower could be the whole top of the flower too. It could be not just the petals, but the actual middle of the flower as well. And then you sit there with the plant for 4 hours, discern what you can. At the end of the 4 hours, I take the top layer.
So this is you kind of sitting, as I say, you're kind of meditating, you're trying to connect again energetically, you're trying to listening, and sort of like that initial story where the elder had you sit and look at the plant, you're sort of in a bit of a meditative state trying to connect.
Yes, and try to remain as neutral as you possibly can. Very often our heads get in the way when it comes to things like this. So you experience what's going on, and you may have insights. And I always take a little notebook and I write down some key words. And then later on, you finish preparing the essence, which would be removing the flowers from the top.
But could I just back up a second? So you're saying when you're having experiences, would you, sitting in the woods here for your 4 hours with the crystal next to the crystal ball, are you having, say, those experiences yourself? Like if this flower helps to impact childhood memories, are you feeling your own rush of that? Are you feeling these effects while it's happening?
Sometimes. Yeah, that's exactly what happens. Or I feel a joy, or sometimes I'm sitting there and for known reason to my conscious mind, I'll start to cry. Like, what was that about? And so there's some deep connection that is sometimes difficult to capture in words, but preparing the essence and then taking it can help to reveal more, especially when you go into dream work at night. I really like to encourage people to take flower essences before bedtime, simply because it unlocks, in some cases, your unconscious, which is much smarter than your ego brain.
Now, do you find that the properties of the plant and what you experienced during this process or relationship with the essences is unique to an individual, or does a certain flower have certain properties? Say if you go in and do this with dandelion as an example, would people have a similar experience with the dandelion, or is it really unique and personal depending on what happens?
That's a great question. I would say that well-researched flower essences have had repeated patterns with different people, and so some of the more well-known ones, for example, the first person to really formalize this at all was a Dr. Edward Bach in England about 100 years ago, and he developed first initially 12 flower essences, and then later in his life 38, and those have been incredibly popularized around the world. And they are for very specific reasons. For example, aspen is made from the aspen tree catkin, is for fear of the unknown, whereas a mimulus or the monkey flower is for fear of the unknown. And so, there's, or fear of the known, sorry. So those are two examples of how flower essences could be very useful for individuals. If there's a fear of something or other that's in somebody's psyche, it probably is creating an inability to reach, a great deal of joy in life because there's always this trepidation. If I do this, what's going to happen? Or, and so those have been very popular. And now around the world, flower essences are produced in just about every continent except Antarctica. And they're.
So is it necessary for me to make my own and have this experience of going out into the woods with my own crystal ball and my 4 hours of meditation where I connect, or can I purchase them in the same way I could purchase herbal medicine and, start the course of therapy using them from there?
One of the things that's interesting about Bach, he was an empath. He was a very sensitive individual, and he was a medical doctor who could pretty well tell when people were sitting in front of him in his office on Harley Street, that really what they didn't need surgery, what they really needed was the shift in consciousness that was going on. And so what he did, for example, with aspen, what he did was he deliberately put himself into that feeling, into that emotion. And then he went into the woods, into the fields in Wales mainly. And when that plant spoke to him, to help him with that feeling that he was creating within himself, then he knew he had the right remedy, and that basically exhausted him. He died not that old and gave us the gift of these flower essences, but that took an immense emotional and physical toll on him to put himself into some of these grief states or other areas of anger, for example, or impatience. And so, that's how he did it. That's not how I did it, but that's how he did it.
So now back to the question previously about the difference between plants and sort of mushroom, the mycelium world. Is there a difference there in the essences? Like, is there some primary characteristics where like flower essences activate on certain levels of our psyche and mushrooms are different?
Yes, that's a great question. So I had a clinical practice, as I mentioned, for about 20 years. And I started producing, I was at a conference in the early 90s, and there was a fellow from Netherlands came, and he had 7 essences with him, 6 flower, and 1 mushroom. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I've never, that's pretty interesting. So I started to produce a few. And then I started, because I had the advantage of clinical practice, inviting some of my clients who I had had a good rapport with to check these out. And so over the next 26 years, I actually started to work with them. And then I wrote up with case studies, these different kinds of things. And finally, in about 5 years ago, North Atlantic published a book called Mushroom Essences, the vibrational healing from kingdom fungi. But basically, the difference is this: that flowers are produced in solar environment, full sun, whereas mushrooms basically are more about the dark. They're around about the underground. They're about the shadow, and they are really essences that help with shadow work, which is what Carl Jung would say is the part of us that we're not aware of. We don't know what we don't know, so to speak, and so very often those are glazed over. And as Jung would remind us, if we don't deal with our shadow, it is the one thing that will devour us. If we're not willing to admit that we're capable of a certain thing, then we probably are, and we're repressing it, and it's creating a dysfunction within our system.
That's fascinating. And as you're saying, flowers, and would even generalize plants as well as being more attuned to solar energy. And now we have this other side, the underground, the darkness, and, the modern world of spirituality. It's very much about embracing your shadow and exploring your shadow work. You see that terminology come up again and again. So, using mushrooms in general, rather like using it as an essence, or if you just sort of ingest it, is it also working on that dimension within us of more the shadow realm, the unknown stuff?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say the analogy would be just like you use plants in their physical form for teas or tinctures, mushrooms, which are the fruiting body, the part that are visual to us on trees or popping out of the ground, those are actually used physically for a lot of things, but mainly for reducing inflammation in our body on a physical level, and for modulating our immune system, keeping our immune system optimal, whether it's over-ramped, as in autoimmune conditions, or underactive, where it's not optimal in production of white blood cells, killer cells, etc. So that they physically taken as a tea or dual extraction. There's compounds in many of the medicinal mushrooms, especially the ones that grow in trees, whether they're wildcrafted or they're grown in factories, that have both water and alcohol soluble constituents that are valuable. And the water soluble are very valuable in that they modulate the immune system, whether it's over ramped as in autoimmune, or if it's deficient as in underactive, and bring it up to normal levels so we can fight different kinds of pathogens and things that are entering our bodies. So they are, but those are generally from the fruiting bodies. The actual mycelium is also grown in particular cases and marketed in the US and other places where they believe that's the living organism. And there's some degree of credibility to some levels of this, where that particular, even though it's a lot of starch and sugar in the grains they grow it on, that living mycelium also has some health benefits. So
okay, and just used. For those listening that aren't totally aware of the physical biology of this, because we think of mushrooms as the thing, but you're saying just the fruiting body. They're like the apples or the berries, but there's the whole apple tree. Would be these really, if you could just maybe describe the world of mycelium biologically and how it exists out there in the world. We see mushrooms on top, but what's going on underneath?
Yeah, exactly. So it's very interesting. I read a story one time, a fellow in Switzerland, he took a hectare of land. And every year for 20 years, he recorded what mushrooms popped up, named them, and recorded this. And every year was different. That is, the mycelium under the ground chose when it was optimal for it to spend the energy to produce this fruiting body, which is really the sexual reproductive part of the mushroom, to send spores into the air to continue the propagation. And so mushrooms will produce that fruiting body when they want to.
But under the ground, they don't look like mushrooms.
No, they look like white little threads. If you ever kicked over a log sometimes in the woods, and you'll see all this kind of web-like, whitish kind of strands, that is mushroom mycelium. And that is the living organism. Yeah.
And that is a network that is going on just underneath our forests, underneath just everywhere we have plant life. Under there is mycelium that's sort of like a web that connects it all in some way.
There are, within a square meter, there are probably hundreds of miles of mycelium looking like little strings. It's unbelievable.
So I recently watched the documentary Fantastic Fungi.
Great film.
Great film. Little surface level. It doesn't go terribly deep. It's for the general public, and it's on Netflix if anybody wants to check it out. A lot of interesting information, but it made a point about this mycelium and the just actual physical structure of it, this almost a neurological network that's kind of going on underneath the forest, is also a reason why the mushroom kingdom and those plants are also beneficial to our neurological network, and also have these other properties, psychotropic and otherwise, that lead us off into other dimensions of consciousness and that sort of thing. Not all mushrooms, but some. And I'm just wondering if we could start with your thoughts in that direction.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's a number of reasons. I mean, for example, there is one fruiting body called lion's mane that actually has shown to have brain neuron growth factor and is often used and now is being combined in some studies with psilocybin and niacin. And it's showing great potential for in microdosing levels, that is a tenth of what would be normally medicinal, for helping people to regain brain health, to increase their ability to create more cells that will store more information and to think in more than a linear way, to bring together different concepts from different parts of the brain that actually help us to see things in a different manner. And so, yes, I love that film. Simply all this time, I love the time lapse stuff, which is coming up, and then Paul, of course, he talks a little bit about how psilocybin helped him with his stuttering and things like that. And I think it's a great film to introduce people to mushrooms, and I really liked it. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts of that connection then to, you said you're currently writing a book on psilocybin, and you've done numerous books on just, fungal. You have the tech almost, a very concise volume, the fungal pharmacy. And so what, outside of, you described the immune system function that mushrooms do, what are the other properties, say, related to our consciousness, and how, this particular kingdom of beings on the planet helps us access expanded consciousness? It's quite a quality for, a little plant friend that's out in the forest.
Yeah, I know. No, it's very interesting. I mean, I just finishing the book on psilocybin. Throughout history, some parts of the world, India, Algeria, before it was desert, and Sweden and Greece, and but basically Mesoamerica, before the Spanish and Cortez created genocide in Mexico and other parts of Central America. The peoples there had ceremonial celebration where the mushrooms were used for as part of their whole consciousness as a civilization. And, that particular thing was buried for hundreds of years. Of course, the Spanish conquistadors and the Catholic Church didn't like people actually exploring their consciousness and their spirituality. They wanted them to be slaves to a religion. And so they basically buried that. Very much like similar to what happened to North American indigenous people too. But the mushrooms themselves were then rediscovered back in the late 1930s, early 40s, and then popularized. Gordon Wasson wrote an article in 1957 in Life magazine describing his experience with a curandera, Maria Sabina, in Mexico. And all of a sudden, whoa, the cat was out of the bag there, so to speak.
But it's also was out of the bag, but then subsequently stuffed back in the bag over the next 20 years. And it's coming out of the bag again in full force now. But, those forces had to kind of play themselves out a little bit longer and still are.
Yeah, Timothy Leary is popularizing, and a number of people were. There was actually, Hoffman, who discovered LSD 25. He also found the identified psilocybin in the mushrooms out of Mexico, and Sandoz, who he worked for in Switzerland, they made a synthetic version, and that became available to researchers in the late 60s. For finding out levels of helping people with depression, anxiety, schizoaffective disorders, things of that nature. In fact, some of the great work was done right in Canada, in Saskatchewan, at Weyburn by Hoffer. And so what happened was, Leary, they made him into, a dangerous man. And Nixon, of course, convinced the United Nations to ban all hallucinogenic research. And it was shut down for about 25 years. And then in the late 90s, several people, the most credit I give to a fellow named Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins. He and Richards applied, and through Johns Hopkins, DEA, FDA, it took them like 3 years to get approval to do the first clinical trial in the modern era.
And this is in the States. This is
in the
US.
States, in Baltimore, to do that with synthetic psilocybin. And it was done, it's interesting, one of the studies was done with 30 people who had stage 4 cancer. And they were suffering the existential stress and distress that you can imagine what that would feel like. And a year later, they sent out a questionnaire. And number one, all 30 were still alive, which is a miracle in itself. And number two, for 70% of them, it was the most significant single event in their life. That the journey with the psilocybin mushrooms, with the synthetic psilocybin, put them more in touch, gave them greater empathy, helped expand their consciousness, their awareness, and extinguish to some degree their fear of dying. And so that was the first study. And now since then, about 130 studies have been done using synthetic psilocybin for everything from post-traumatic stress, obsessive compulsive, anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, you name it. And in my book, I list about 100 and some of them are the more interesting studies.
Now, the psilocybin, which has kind of been popularized, or, many kind of are aware of that particular, what would you call it? Psilocybin, like the active ingredient? Is that what it be? Because it's not just one single mushroom called psilocybin. There's various strains, correct?
Yeah, the best way to term it would be psilocybin containing mushrooms. And most of them are of the psilocybe or Paniola species. I would say, most of them.
And how many different species are you aware of that have psilocybin?
Over 200.
Throughout the entire world, or they only
throughout the entire world? Yeah, exactly. And many of them in Mexico. I would say the largest number have been identified there. A Gaston Guzman, I alone, I think, identified about 70 of them. Paul Stamets, name you recognize, he also is co-author for a number of them. John Allen. There's a number of people who were involved in the original identification. But the thing is, psilocybin and psilocin are found in most of the mushrooms. Psilocybin is converted in the gut into psilocin, which is actually the active ingredient that then has influence on our serotonin receptors. So the psilocin is not very stable. So psilocybin going in, get that little tummy kind of thing, and then the psilocin is what the active ingredient. Yeah.
When your neural pathways start rebuilding what was lost, and you just microdose some mushrooms, now you have a meeting with your boss. Turn off your Zoom screen, just go play lacrosse. Okay, so psilocybin is an active ingredient that has all consciousness properties that are kind of medicinal. But previously you had mentioned some other ones like lion's mane that are also helpful kind of on brain function or neurological sort of function without being sort of like psychoactive in the same way that psilocybin is. So right. Do you think that there's a quality to the psychoactive qualities of psilocybin that give it like a little bit more punch, a little bit more zest, or doing something a little bit more, say, than a lion's mane is?
Yes. Yeah. The psilocin has a direct influence on our serotonin receptors, which really involve basically our experiences of comfort and joy, so to speak. That is, serotonin actually is the feel-good molecule. And so the fact that it has a direct influence on that receptor is significant. Yeah, and there's one of my chapters in the book on it's called psilocybin. One of the chapters involves the chemistry. For those who are interested, and how it does affect the brain and what they know to this point. But basically, bottom line is it appears to create, they thought initially that psilocybin would create a circus in our head, because people would get these visual colors and what they called hallucinations, which really aren't. But what they found is that psilocybin actually stills the mind. It's almost like we experienced earlier, when your computer's not working, you shut it down and it restarts. And whatever glitch was happening, it fixes that. And so that default mode in the brain that it activates really helps people to reset and rethink, re-feel about past experiences. And that's why it's so powerful for post-traumatic stress, that you actually, instead of people getting that repeated pattern, they actually have the ability to reset their experience.
Now, you said previously that these mushrooms exist everywhere in the world. So they have, they're a basic part of nature, so to speak, that, here we are, these humans walking around on the surface of this planet all over the world and all over the place since the dawn of time. These psilocybin mushrooms have been part of our experience, or they've at least been there. So what do you see as kind of that relationship on Yeah, any sort of like deeper level earth energy, that sort of thing, what it's trying to teach us, where it's trying to direct us as a species, our consciousness?
Well, that's a great question. I give, this is not original thought. It's certainly credited to Terence McKenna, who wrote Food of the Gods. And he and his brother, Dennis, they popularized the growing of psilocybin after experiences in South America. Uh, I believe, as he suggests, that psilocybin is here to save the planet. It's to save humans. And the fact that we're attracted to them and we now grow and spread them around the world, as they're becoming more popular and ingest it more, and they're spreading like spores of a mushroom, that they're actually here to connect us more with nature and make us understand we are nature. We're all part of nature, and to get rid of this separate autocratic kind of technocratic approach to basically thinking there's only value in the tree if you can cut it down and make money. I mean, that consciousness has got to change, and so I think that's what they're part of.
It does seem like many people who have initial experiences. I remember my first experiences sitting in high school health class, where they say, don't do drugs. Drugs are bad. And they showed us these films about Johnny does acid and, that sort of thing, and how it just ended up in a sane asylum or he jumped out a window or something like that. And I remember we would go out on the weekend and do mushrooms and acid and just go, fuck, no, it's not like that at all. Like,
yeah, you didn't believe them
and
at
it
all.
almost had this opposite effect on us and myself, going like, oh, this system is somehow what's messed up. Like, if you guys are sitting there, this big building that you make us go to as kids and this education, and you're telling us this is bad, but I went out and had my own experience, and it was like, no, that really expanded something in me. And Saturday morning, I was a different person, and it was positive. And my own self made me go, well, you guys are the ones that are fucked, not these plants or these substances.
Well, it's why you're sitting where you are today. I mean, I've known you for a few years, and the work you do is helping people connect with their soul-like level with plants or mushrooms or whatever. And you've been doing that work of communication for a long time, and it probably led you to wanting to share that. And so I think as more and more people connect, even if it is on very popularized, like it's millions of young people doing microdosing, because you can imagine young 20-year-olds, like they look at what's going on in the world with climate change and the corruptness of our political systems and just the economic disadvantage they're experiencing. I guess they're anxious and depressed, and so I really believe that the future will show that this mushroom really will make a difference to the planet.
What do you see as the future now going forward as, say, this information's out there? It's, I think my understanding is it's been decriminalized, at least in, certain states of America. I don't know what's going to happen in Canada or what the future is there. But what are you seeing as sort of the use of this substance going forward, like pharmacologically, health benefits and that sort of thing? Is it going to gain awareness in popular culture and start to spread like the spores, as you were saying?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, these double-blind, placebo-controlled trials that have been going on for the last dozen years now have led to, for example, Oregon. People voted there, and by next year, the legislators have got to figure out a way that makes it legal for people to consume the mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, in the presence of a qualified psychologist or health professional. And I think there's some importance there because, as many people have said, the idea of set and setting of when you take psilocybin is important with regards to helping ensure that you get a favorable journey, but you also get a impactful benefit that is long lasting. And so I think that's going to happen. And in fact, California, a month ago, the California Psilocybin Initiative, they're going for a plebiscite in 2022 that by early 2023, if it passes, it's going to make psilocybin legal for both recreational and medicinal. That is a whole can of worms too. But the reality is it's happening, and in Canada, there are now 30 some people who have been given exemption to grow their own mushrooms to consume for people suffering from existential distress associated with cancer, and more and more of that's going to be happening. In fact, TheraPsil, a company out of Vancouver, they're pushing the government under the Constitution, just like cannabis was 10 years ago, that people have the right to ingest natural substances for their own health and well-being. So I'm hopeful that things are going to move forward, and I wouldn't be surprised. And in fact, I'm involved with a company right now out of Edmonton that are going to start human clinical trials with this particular substance starting in the first quarter of 2022. So, yeah, very hopeful.
Now, on the flip side of, we're at this age of, embracing things like, look what's happened with cannabis in the last 10, 20 years, where it kind of went for this fringe substance. Now, cannabis and CBD, it's like the wonder drug. It's good for frickin' everything, whether it's true or not, but there's promotion. It's like, this has got foot pain, you don't like your boss at work. It's like CBD, that's the thing for you. So if we're going perhaps in the same direction with psilocybin, and microdosing is really popular, as you say, there's everything from real scientific clinical tests going on in the medical community. It's also can be really powerful. Like, you like, damn, you like these things, can really take you to other dimensions, some even say, right? So, and can have a very, very strong psychoactive and physical effect. So are there, in your mind, also any risks? As you had mentioned before, it's good to maybe have these things go down in a clinical environment. If you're going to really use it for therapeutic reasons, to do it with a professional, someone who's experienced in that way. So what do you see sort of that zone there of like, is there any kind of adverse effects that psilocybin could be having on people?
Yeah, I do believe. I mean, it's already recorded. They, for example, will not. There's a very quick cortisol rush in our body, and immediately after ingesting, that prohibits people with hypertension from taking part in clinical trials. So people with high blood pressure, which is quite a number of people in the society, right? So that care must be used with those individuals. Anybody with schizoaffective genetic background, probably not a good idea. Probably shouldn't be used by anybody in under 21, really. I mean, there are a number of reasons for that. Also with epilepsy. And so in my book, I talk about a number of the contraindications for who should probably not be involved in this. Yeah.
Okay, it isn't just a like go for it, wonder drug, come one, come all sort of thing.
No, it's sort of like, and I also think I remember studying with shaman in Peru and back in the early 80s, and I asked them like number one, my first question was like, how did you know to put these two of millions of plants? How did you know to put these two together to get ayahuasca mixture that actually has this profound effect on people? And they would often say, well, the plants told us. going back to our wisdom of the plants earlier. But the second thing is, why would some people need this and other people not? And they would reply in probably a poor translation, but they would say, well, some people are thicker than others. That is, in order to break open that little level of consciousness, which allows you to see more of what's going on around us, sometimes you need a little bit of a kickstart, and not everybody needs that.
So on that level, you're saying that these plants, these mushrooms, are here to help us and take us to this into the future. They're healing us on a consciousness level. And what do you see as kind of like the consciousness healing that needs to take place for us, as well as, physical healing?
Yeah. Well, I really believe that we are at a crisis point on the planet. It's a fairly populated place. There's a lot of environmental, ecological destruction going on. There's a lot of things that are, economically, politically, socially, we need some serious readdressing. And I believe that looking at the studies, people who have experienced psilocybin, they have a shift of consciousness towards more empathy and more awareness of their surroundings and want to take care of the planet. And I think that that is our great hope for the future.
I remember reading something about the LSD trials of the 50s that were going on in Saskatchewan, and there was a description of people like having an experience with like seeing a tree for the very first time, like where we get into patterns and habits with how we address the world. And, we get out of our house in the morning when we're on our way to work and we go, oh, there's this tree in my front yard. And we go, it's a tree. Yeah, I know, it's a tree. And you get in our car and we go off to work. But sort of these substances, and like it was LSD in particular, was like people would be like, oh my freaking God, this is a tree. Look, this is the most magical, amazing, wonderful thing I've ever seen, and rightfully so. Like on some level, we should get blown away every time we see a tree because of its beauty, like what an amazing life form it is. But if we do that, we don't get in the car and go to work, so to speak, because we just spend 4 hours on our front lawn looking at leaves if we are in that state of consciousness. So you have any thoughts?
Also, yeah. And I would say we also don't get in our truck with our chainsaw and go down into the forest and cut a bunch of trees down that, for making money. And so I think there is a great need for a shift of consciousness.
Absolutely. And so you said you've done this research. You got the book coming out soon. When could we expect more from your wide library of titles that you say 57 to date? Will the psilocybin book be number 58?
Yeah, it will be 58. Yeah, it's called Psilocybin, the Magic, the Science, and Research. And so it's been fun. It's been it's something I wanted to do for a while and finally got around to it. And I think people will enjoy it, will appreciate it. I go through all the history going way back and like what is a mushroom even for people who don't know that. And then all the trials and the people involved, the personalities that were involved, like some of the great stories of, Timothy Leary and, Terence McKenna and et cetera, and John W. Allen. And then look at each of the mushrooms. I look at about the top 50 of what their contents are for people of interest and how they've been used traditionally, and then a little bit about the truffle trade in Netherlands. In the Netherlands, they're not allowed to sell the fruiting body, but through a kind of a quirk of law, they're able to sell the little sclerotia, or the little mycelium that grows underground. And you get about the same dosage as a microdose. And so that's $1 billion industry in Holland right now. And yeah, so those things are happening.
And when do you expect this book to be available for the general public?
This book should be available on Amazon within the next 2 weeks.
Wow. Okay. And its title again?
Psilocybin, the magic, science, and research. Psilocybin mushrooms. Yeah. Psilocybin mushrooms. The science, the magic, the science, and research. Yeah.
And how can people connect with the 57 other books that you have written?
Thank you. Well, we do have a website. My wife works very hard has created an e-store for us. And our address is www.self, S-E-L-F, heal, H-E-A-L, distributing. That's all one word, selfhealdistributing.com. And they can find my 50-some books, and my wife has 7 as well that are very interesting, associated with goddess work, aromatherapy, and different, delving into different things such as flower essences. And so all those books are available there, and you can look them up.
Wonderful, Robert. It's as you say, 58 books. That's a lot. That's a big contribution to our understanding. So, thanks on behalf of my fellow humans for doing that work that you've been doing your whole life, and look forward to the book. And thanks so much for joining us here today. That was very enlightening into the world of mycelium and consciousness and beyond.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I've always enjoyed your company. I loved filming with you a few years back and with Bev in Yukon. And thanks very much for this.
When government and big pharma stop telling us the pills we get to take, and lion's mane and reishi mushrooms are in my McDonald's shake, I'll face my darkness, unless of course I need a break. Then I'll just make myself a steak, a portobello mushroom steak, portobello mushroom steak, portobello mushroom steak. Yeah, man. Whoa, groovy, baby. If you didn't guess it already, my thanks to Jefferson Airplane and their tune White Rabbit for the musical inspiration of the mushroom episode. Likely it was just that one line in the song that I kind of picked up on and played with. And lo and behold, there we have. Thanks, Jefferson Airplane. That early stuff you did was super dope. The stuff you did later, like I built this city on rock and roll. Oh my God. We need to wipe that from the collective consciousness. But the mid-70s was kind of weird all around, like everywhere. Thank God the Ramones showed up. Whoa, Sex Pistols. There was like, it was getting out of control. It was like something needs to be done. So thanks to them. And thanks to Robert Rogers, his wisdom, the years of experience he has. Again, check out his new book on psilocybin. All the links are in the info for this episode, where you can get the book. You can go to his website, Amazon, anywhere you like, pick up that book. So grateful to have had Robert on the show. If you'd like to connect, it's always great to hear from you. Let me know what's working, any ideas you have for the show, anything. Hey, is anybody you want me to talk to? I'm happy to listen to some suggestions. McNuttiest.com is my website. Lots of ways to connect with me there. McNuttiest on Facebook, McNuttiest on Instagram, McNuttiest on Twitter, but I never go there because that's just a frickin' hornet's nest, people. But fun one for lots of people. Lots of shit gets thrown around there, but don't try me on Twitter. You want to send me an email, yo at McNuttiest.com is all you need to know. Thanks for tuning in, people, and spending some time in the McNuttiest dimension. I'm Chris McNutt, and we'll catch you next time.
McNuttiest.